I really have two goals for using a course blog in this cryptography course. One is to get students talking to each other and learning from each other, creating a learning community in the course. The second goal is to connect my students with authentic audiences through the power of the open web. And so I'll share a few examples of activities I've used to try to reach these goals, and I think some evidence of success. One of the activities I do is I have my students actually read and respond to each other's blog posts during class occasionally. This is a strategy I picked up from a former Vanderbilt English professor, Humberto Garcia. And I found it works pretty well, actually. So in this case, we were looking at the role of cryptography in World War II. I asked my students to read the textbook section on this topic and then blog about reasons they saw for the Allied cryptographic victory over the Germans. So the British cryptographers in particular at Bletchley Park, led by Alan Turing and others, were able to crack the German Enigma code somewhat famously these days, thanks to a movie that came out the other year. And so I asked students to try to hypothesize what was it about the Allies' approach that led to success over the Germans in this case. And so each student wrote up a blog post where they made a short argument and tried to make a case for it. During class, what I did is I printed off all of these blog posts. I had 15 students in the class, and so it was a small enough class where that was pretty reasonable. I passed out the printouts to students so they each received someone else's blog post. And I asked them to read the post, summarize it briefly, offer some handwritten feedback to the author of the post so they might improve their writing, and then get out their laptops and actually respond to the post live on the blog itself. This was one of the posts from a student, and then the comment left by another student that was actually written and composed live digitally during class as we worked. Now, what I was doing while they were doing that was I was using the moderation panel on my blogging software to see the comments as they were coming in. I picked a few that I thought were particularly interesting or relevant to share with students on the big screen, and then we discussed them as a large class. This is a writing seminar, and so getting students to read, to summarize, to respond to someone else's writing, these are all key skills for this course, and I wanted to spend some class time doing this. The particular ask in these comments was to add some complexity to the arguments that the students presented. And so this student kind of summarized the argument in the blog post and then added a little nuance, asked a few questions around it to make that argument a little more complex and a little more interesting. That's the kind of critical thinking that I want them to do in this course. And so it seemed appropriate that we would spend some class time practicing that. Having students read and write during class in a writing seminar isn't unusual, but having them do it on the blog, I think, added a degree of authenticity to the process that was helpful and productive. Another in-class activity that I used with the students was to look at the tweets posted by Edward Snowden. So Edward Snowden famously came forward with a lot of information about National Security Agency surveillance practices in the United States and elsewhere. And since then, he's become an advocate for privacy in various ways, and he's actually got pretty strong Twitter skills. And so we had, after talking about Edward Snowden, watching the movie that was made about him, and discussing the kind of debates between surveillance and security and privacy, I asked students to work in groups to read through Edward Snowden's tweets, to pick one that they wanted to write about. And so in pairs and trios, they did this, picking a tweet and then writing about it on the blog live during class, connecting it to other things that we had talked about or adding complexity to whatever argument that Edward Snowden was making. And so this was, again, a nice, I think, really fun way in this case to engage a little more deeply with kind of live text, right, digital text through Twitter, and do some collaborative writing during class, right, and to connect what they were reading with previous texts and discussions that we had had. One a blog post assignment I gave for my students followed up on a guest speaker I had in class. This last offering the course, I brought in Ilanka Dunin to speak with the class. She's a cryptographer and a game designer who lives around here in Nashville. And she came to the class and talked about her experiences with cryptography. It was just an incredible lecture and storytelling from her part. She also has a really nice website where she has a lot of resources and links and information on various aspects of cryptography. So after class, I had my students look through her website, think about her talk, and then on the blog, write about something interesting they found on her website. Now, one of my students, Colleen, as you can see here, wrote what I thought was a really compelling essay making the argument that one of the reasons that Ilanka Dunin is good at cryptography is that she's a bit of a polymath. She has a lot of different interests, a very diverse kind of professional background, and that makes her a better code breaker. It kind of allows her to be creative in some really useful ways. And so I thought this was a really interesting essay. One of my other students did too. So another student left a comment on the original essay. I told them that they didn't have to write a post for this assignment. They could comment on someone else's post as an alternative. And so this other student felt that Colleen's argument was pretty persuasive, and so she added her own comments and weight to that argument. And again, I felt the essay was actually pretty good, and so I tweeted about it. Ilanka Dunin is also on Twitter, and she retweeted my tweet, which exposed this essay, this blog post, to her network. And in fact, one of her former colleagues, Steve Lux, came by and left a comment on the blog post as well, kind of confirming Colleen's hypothesis that, in fact, Ilanka is a pretty creative person, and talked about some examples of how that played out in the work environment in which he knew her. And so again, one of my goals for the course blog is to connect my students' work with a wider audience and bring some authenticity to that work. And this was a really nice exhibit of how that played out with this guest speaker. A couple of times in this course, I've kind of gone beyond the blog itself to another blog, Wonders and Marvels. This is a group blog. It's edited by Holly Tucker, who is a professor of French and a few other things here at Vanderbilt. Wonders and Marvels is a blog about the history of science and medicine. Holly has a number of contributors who are scholars and authors and journalists, and they write these really fun posts about kind of curiosities of science and medicine. Well, I asked Holly a few years ago if perhaps my students could try to write for her blog, and she really liked this idea. So that assignment where students have to write about a code or cipher from history, for a couple of years, I had them write that paper, right? They'd send me the rough draft. I gave them feedback on it. They gave me a revised version. I graded that revised version, and then I sent it to Holly, and she treated it as she would a submission to her blog. She gave students feedback and asked for changes to be made. And if students followed her instructions and made those edits, she would then run my students' work on her blog. This was exciting for a couple of reasons. One is that it brought a real large and authentic audience to my students' work. It wasn't just kind of the hypothetical audience of my own course blog, but it was the real regular audience that she gets on Wonders and Marvels. Thousands of people read her blog every week, and my students' writing would be kind of connected with that audience. The other piece was having Holly come to my class and talk to my students about the audience for Wonders and Marvels and who they are and what they're interested in, how you write for an audience like that, at what level you have to explain technical matters, how you write a good hook or opening, right? By having that process, not all of my students got their posts all the way published on her blog, but all of them benefited from having a very real and concrete audience in mind for their writing and trying to write to that audience. And I'm deeply grateful for Holly for helping me with this, for spending time with my students, and for connecting my students' work with a wider audience through her blog. Here on screen, you see some of the student posts from the most recent iteration of this project. Then something kind of exciting happened. After the first semester I did this, a couple months later, Holly got an email from a website called IO9, which covers kind of history, kind of science and pop culture. They had read one of my students' essays on her blog, and they wanted to republish it. So Holly got in touch with me. I got in touch with a student. We talked about it, pros and cons. In general, we felt like, yeah, this is actually a nice opportunity for my student. And so my student, Alberto Perez, college freshman, was published on IO9, which has, like 60,000 readers a month or something crazy like that. And so that was pretty exciting. Again, there's the kind of hypothetical audience of my own course blog. Some of my students got to have their work shared on the real audience of Holly's Wonders and Marvels blog, and one of them even got picked up on a pretty significant website, IO9, and connected with a very large and very authentic audience for his work. And so it's this kind of thing that's really exciting when I think about students writing in public, and a course blog is a nice way to connect them, not only with each other, so that they can learn from and with each other, but with wider, authentic audiences for their work beyond.